Okay, so here we are in 3ds Max. I'll be using 3ds Max 2009, but these techniques should work for 3ds Max 2008, Max 9, Max 8, all the way down to probably even Max 5. I will be providing the OBJs and FBX, but with the old damaged pillar I use mental ray to generate the normal maps in ambient occlusion. But in this example I would like to use light tracer, which has been in Max since Max 5, and the technique hasn't changed since then. So here we have the high-res model. And this high-res model, some of it was roughly made in Max, and then everything was taken into Mudbox and then sculpted. So the scene is pretty heavy. It's around 6 million polygons. But one thing I'd like to point out here is when you have your high-res model ready for the low-res capture, a good technique to use is to open the material editor, and what I normally do is I create a ray trace material, but in reality you could use a standard material as well. The reason I use ray trace is sometimes I may try to capture a speck or something like that, and I'll experiment, but standard material will be fine because all we really want is diffuse color, and that's pretty much it. So I have a material for each different material type in the scene. So I have a concrete, but basically I just have a brown color, and it has a texture in there, but I don't want to use a texture at all. Now you can experiment with giving it a bump map and a diffuse texture, but the problem with that is with a super high res mesh like this, or like all the elements in the scene, you have to add UV coordinates if you want it to do anything decent with the texture. You could also experiment with some procedural textures, but even then it needs some kind of UVs. And what I found out is if you add UVs to these, your file size gets insanely large. This file size is like 170 megs, and I added UVs to everything and the file size went over a gig. And when I realized that, Max was also becoming unstable. And so what I did was I went in to each one of these meshes and I added a modifier called UVW remove. I'll just show you, it's down here, UVW mapping clear. So it was at the bottom there. And you just want to clear usually the first mapping channel. If it has multiple ones, you want to clear those as well. Let me just undo that. So remember, when you import these models from Mudbox or ZBrush as OBJ, that you uncheck texture coordinate, and also smoothing groups for that matter. So no texture coordinates and no smoothing groups, or just one smoothing group across the whole thing. You don't want it faceted. So what I did was I added these materials. You have, I'll get rid of these. You have, this is for the metal. You have like a light gray. And this is the wood, which is a brown. This is the dirt, which is a dark brown. This is the cloth, which I just made a bluish color. And this black one I put for the cable, like the cable lines, and the rebar. So I applied these to the high-res models in the scene. So now you can see the color representation. And I reuse some for other. So you see here the high-res model. For the cloth, I used the built-in cloth system to get something base, and then I took it in the Mudbox, and I used some rebar and some ground, and then I have this telephone pole. And I really wanted to get a different variety of materials, which could help in this DVD get different practical examples and how to deal with those. So this is pretty much the high-res model. And now we go to the low-res. You'll notice that this is split off into different sections. So we have a concrete, sign, wood, ground, cloth, fence. And basically, if you go to the concrete low poly, and let me just drag these into the high poly node. So if you notice here, we have a projection modifier, which I'll show you in a minute. But one thing I noticed that's very important, and it was a problem on the old damaged pillar DVD, but I didn't explain exactly how to fix it in 3ds Max. But basically, if I hide these, this base low-res mesh that I generated using Polycruncher has basically a default smoothing. Like if you add auto smoothing, put it like 45 or 30, you'll notice that it does a fairly decent job of keeping hard edges where the angle changes. But the problem with using this default setting is it's going to create pretty much a seam in your normal map everywhere where the smoothing group is different. So sometimes we would want this, and sometimes we don't want this. So what I had done was I went and added an edit poly on top, and I basically just selected all of these faces and gave it a smoothing group. And to do that, you just go into polygon mode, select each one of these faces that you want to be straight or flat, and you give it a smoothing group, which I gave it a 1. And then I would select these other faces, which I want to have their own smoothing, like inside here. I gave it a 32. And I did this around the mesh. You want as few smoothing groups as possible because you want as few seams as possible in your normal map. Now, why would I even want to do this? Well, if I had another smooth and I just gave it 1, you'll notice what it does is it tries to smooth the angle across the whole surface so that when the light hits it, it bends around all these curves. And what happens is you get these deep shadows, and it looks very bad and creates very big artifacts. But what you'll notice when you generate your normal map is you'll see these same gradients in your normal map. And this is really bad. And it's also hard to fix in Photoshop. So what fixes this is the seam that separates the two and gives you the appearance that you see here in 3D Max. This same appearance is also going to be in your normal map, which you'll see later when we look through it. Now, there's no real science to this, but basically it takes some experimentation, and you don't want it all smooth and you don't want it all hard. So you're going to want to experiment with a lower res setting of generating your normal map and seeing what looks the best. So I'll delete that. And if I add an unwrap modifier and go to its settings, you'll notice that I have this uniquely unwrapped. It's the rebar and the concrete. But in order to fit the most pixels on this UV layout, I had to mirror and flip upside down the backside of this. Now, if you use Mental Ray to generate your normal maps like in the old Damaged Pillar DVD, Mental Ray seems to have a problem and can't render the normal map for flipped UVs. I haven't figured out the solution for that, but the way you could fix it is to don't flip them. But if I did that, I would have to move these UVs around and scale them down in order to make them fit. So I'd rather maximize the amount of pixels. So if you use the built-in 3dsmax scanline renderer with light tracer, it can handle the mirrored UVs just fine. And to be honest, the result that it spits out is just as good as Mental Ray's, in my opinion. So this is pretty much the one element that makes up the concrete. And the sign, I ended up leaving the sign on its own when I unwrapped it. So it's just the sign. And then we have the wood. And with the wood, it was interesting that everything was so tall. So what I ended up doing was setting this resolution to be twice as high. So you'll notice if I expand the options down here, if I set the height to 512, that's the correct display. Now, the problem with this, doing it like this, is when you render to texture, it renders out the whole double size. So it can take your render time a lot longer. So basically, if we do a 4096 by 2048, it's going to pretty much render it out at 4096 by 4096. And it will take a long time to render. And then it squishes it in. But since your UVs are laid out like this, it'll look correct. But this was the best way I could think of laying out these UVs to maximize space and to get everything as least elements as possible. With the ground, it's pretty simple. It's just the ground uniquely laid out with some bricks and some rocks. The cloth, I just kept the cloth together and they're laid out like this. So I try to combine unique elements. And the last one was the fence, which was a challenge for me to get for this DVD, but I ended up going with a slat background with the fence above it to avoid transparency problems that didn't look so great. So basically I also flipped this one and laid them out unique and then the bars on their own. So once you have your low poly model that surrounds your high poly model and UV'd, which if you need more information on this, I would recommend the old damaged pillar DVD, which goes into the entire process of doing this. What you want to do is you want to go to the render to texture settings. So you go rendering, render to texture, or hit 0. Let me move this over here. So in here, you'll select each element or each object, and you're going to want to enable projection mapping and then hit pick. Then you want to pick the high-res model that this is going to get the normal map from. Also in this situation, I ended up going and not using the cage at all, and instead just setting an offset of 3. Now, this offset may be different on different scenes because it may be based off the scale. So the default is 10, and I just kept playing with this number until I got something that looked right. And when you do your final render, you would want to uncheck ray mist check because it adds red to your scene, and it's it makes it kind of annoying to get rid of. I had forgot to do this when I rendered the high-res ones out. Also, when you do your high-res, you may want to go into settings and then go into renderer, and then in the super sampling, you want to enable it and pick Hammersley. Now the default is 0.5, and so basically you don't want to go too high with this unless you have a lot of time to wait for this to render. So if you go all the way to 1, it's probably going to take double the render time or more. So I'll just leave this off for now. And in advanced lighting, you're going to want to choose light tracer. So I don't want to turn that off. I want to leave it to light tracer. 150 is a good setting that will leave a little bit of noise, but if you want it to be completely smooth, then you may want to use maybe 256 or even 512. But for test, I would recommend 32, which will make it really grainy, but you could see what's going on and fix any errors. Bounces I like to leave at 0, which leaves the cracks really dark. Now make sure that you also add a skylight, which will be in standard lights, into your scene, which I've already done. Now, once you've enabled projection, picked the high-res model, you're going to want to add these different elements. And you can experiment with what these different elements give you, but basically all I end up using is the diffuse and the normal and the lighting map. So the diffuse, normal, and lighting map. The diffuse map is just going to give you the colors that we picked for the high-res models. The normal map is going to give you the normal map, and the lighting map is going to give you the nice ambient occlusion. And if you don't pick slots in here, it'll give you an error, but that's alright because I never use those anyway. Now you want to make sure you pick your first UV channel, but if you have multiple UV channels, you can use those as well. But in this demonstration, we only have one. So you want to do the same thing to all of these. And you notice with the wood, I want to get 2048 by 4096 to make sure all of these texels line up pretty much the same. And a texel is pretty much the pixel density on screen. So once you have all of these set up, you're going to want to go render to texture by hitting render. And you can select these all and do it at the same time. And up here is where you're going to want those textures to go. So anyway, once you have these basics set up and you rendered out your textures, this is a very important step in starting your texturing. Matter of fact, this process saves me a lot of time when texturing and really gives me a good head start whenever I get into Photoshop. So assuming you've done all of that, we'll now go into Photoshop and check out the rendered results.